In grade school, we might learn history in class and think of it as a straightforward recitation of facts and dates. Today's guest, however, explains that history can be a high stakes conflict shaping the collective memories and national narratives that can prepare a nation for great trials and even war. She's Jade McGlynn this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University.
And I'm G. Wayne Miller, also with Salve's Pell Center.
And our guest today is Dr. Jade McGlynn, a research fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She's also the author of two timely and insightful books, Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia, as well as Russia's War. She joins us today from the United Kingdom. Jade, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You and I had a chance to talk, and the books together and individually are really important and fascinating reads. I want to start, though, talking about Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia, which is an interesting exploration of the way Putin and his regime are using memory and history for their own purposes. But I'm wondering, to get started, if you could explain the difference between those two things, between memory and history.
I think that's a really important distinction, and it's one that sometimes gets lost. So the difference between memory and history is either facts as they happened, or at least an attempt to try to work out the facts as they happen. Whereas memory is the remembrance, either individual, direct, or in many of the cases that I look at, more of a cultural or collective memory that's passed down and is recreated and is very pliable. So yes, there's some overlap, but we're really talking about quite different topics.
Is this the stuff of national identity?
I think so, because every single nation needs a story that it can cohere around, and every single individual makes sense of the future of their lives, through reference to the past. That's just a normal way of living your life. And this idea of belonging to something bigger, to having that sense of continuity, is increasingly important. And I think particularly perhaps in a secular age as well, history begins to take on more important elements, more important ways of tying people together and into a story, into that sense of community that perhaps some feel is lost.
So what is Putin trying to achieve with his appropriation of Russian history and memory?
So I think there's two elements here. First of all, everybody's trying to do this in a way. I mean, I think that there's nothing pathological really about what the Kremlin or what Russia is trying and what has been trying to do with memory. It's perhaps more a question of the extreme lengths to which it has gone. But many of the tactics that I describe, I think you'll find, pretty much, if not in all, then in most countries of the world. What makes the Russian case so interesting is a couple of things. So first of all, it's that there really wasn't a post-Soviet idea of what it means to be Russia, of why Russia belongs, why is Russia, why do Russians belong together? And there were various sort of efforts to create one, but nothing really worked or could work. And in the end, the focus came to history, firstly because pride over the victory in the Great Patriotic War, which is what a term Russians use to refer to not so much the Second World War as specifically 1941 to 1945 and the Soviet fight against Nazism. So that was this pride in that victory was one of the most unifying elements that the country had. And to be honest, when Putin came to power in 2000, there really weren't that many things to unify around. And so increasingly this sense of a shared historical narrative became, I suppose, the anchor. And then, of course, it also tied into, well, bluntly, a lack of vision for the future. And so over time, increasingly became so that the future would be what I describe as a sort of sense of nostalgic anticipation. It will be good because we'll recreate some of the bits that we lost.
What is the effect, the lingering effect of the collapse of the Soviet Union on Russia and Putin more specifically?
Well, Putin has himself spoken quite a lot about the effect on him, and there's an awful lot of material and journalism on that point. I think I'm probably better placed to speak about the effect or the use of the effect. So the 1990s, sometimes I'm quite surprised because you'll see it's quite common to hear commentators in the West discuss it as, okay, well, that's when Russia had this sort of experience of democracy and liberalism. And I think that's a very flawed interpretation of what happened in the 1990s, to put it mildly. The transition to democracy never really worked out unless, certainly in my reading of that period and my reading of sort of Yeltsin's hyper-presidentialism and the very flawed election of 1996. And the reason why this matters is because Russians became very, very disillusioned. There was a lot of hope with the fall of the Soviet Union, and Russians became very disillusioned both by capitalism because they experienced an incredibly extreme form of it. I mean, that's why it was called shock therapy. And the sudden sort of inequality was very jarring for many. And also because it led to, incredible poverty with people not being paid, with people being paid in gherkins or pickles instead of their actual wages. It's very humiliating, and a sense of a loss of status that was once there, even if perhaps it was only imagined that it was there. There was that feeling of loss, of a profound loss. And one of the elements that the Kremlin or the state-aligned media has been incredibly effective at doing is taking that sense of personal humiliation that many people felt understandably, and then mixing it, inflating it with a national humiliation, this sense that, yes, you felt humiliated and the West was responsible for that, just as they humiliated us in Yugoslavia in 1999, just as they humiliated us, by getting involved in spreading color revolutions, in their view, in Georgia, in Kyrgyzstan, in Ukraine in 2004. And now Putin has finally got Russia back off its knees, and we can avenge these humiliations, we can undo them. And it's incredibly powerful because it's mixed that personal element with a sense of a broader national cause.
So what was Vladimir Putin doing during this period, during the 1990s, and how has that affected him today in charge of Russia?
So there's the famous moment that's often cited in any long reads on Vladimir Putin about him being in Dresden and sort of calling for support or advice from Moscow, and then the sort of famous line, "Moscow is silent." And that sense, he speaks about it a lot. It does appear to have had an effect on him, that the notion of the collapse of the state, and something that could be so all-powerful. And to be honest with you, it's a very cohering element within Russian society as well. We've just had the sort of Prigozhin rebellion, and there we saw in Putin's speeches, he referred a lot to this sense of, well, the state could collapse, we could have times of troubles, we could have 1917, the Civil War. And it seemed an odd line if your whole sort of gambit is about, I'm a very strong leader and I keep Russia secure. But actually it makes a lot of sense if we then think back to what coheres the elites and the people in Russia. Well, that fear of collapse. And that fear of collapse is because Putin himself also, during the 1990s experienced a loss of status, a sense of trying to find his place within the world. Luckily for Putin, and I think unluckily for Russia, he managed to find his place, which was as a deputy to Anatoly Sobchak, who was the mayor of the first democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg, newly named back to its old name. And there he was involved with a number of sort of ventures and schemes that I would encourage anybody who wants to take his complaints about sort of corruption and how he saved Russia from sort of Western exploitation. I would encourage them to go and explore his business dealings in the 1990s to see whether or not they should take those complaints at face value.
You know, you mentioned the power and prominence of the Great Patriotic War, or the Second World War, as we call it here in the Atlantic world, in Russian history and in Russian memory today. But Russian history is rich with moments and, you know, particular characters, if you will. Are there other aspects of that story that the current Russian regime favors to tell, and are there some that it tries to de-emphasize?
Yes, definitely. So there's quite a fair bit that it does try to emphasize, although the Great Patriotic War is certainly the focal point. Other elements that it tries to emphasize is the sense of sort of Russian great power status, particularly within the Soviet Union, for example, after the Second World War. And also, you know, sort of naturally Russian sort of achievements, the first man in space, periods of imperial expansion, for example, under Catherine the Great, under Peter the Great or Peter the First, and all the way going back to sort of Ivan the Terrible, who they sort of every now and again try to rehabilitate in the oddest ways, and going back then even to Ivan the Third, and Ivan the Third is an important character because he justifies his right to sort of take certain lands, for example, Novgorod, by claiming that he is the heir. So he expands sort of what was then Muscovy, and he does so using the claim that he is the heir to the dynasty that comes from Kievan Rus. And this is an important moment, really, I suppose, in Russian historiography, or an important sort of sense, because this is quite central to the notion that Russia is the inheritor of Rus. And that's something that really has been taught for a very long time, not only in Russia, but also in the West. But actually, when we look at it in terms of history rather than in terms of memory, it's really it's quite difficult to make that case of continuity and legacy there.
So you argue that this myth-making is central to Russia's conception of itself today, and also how Putin wants Russians to think about their future. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
So I think that myth-making in general is quite central to how nations tend to think about themselves, but ideally there might be a few different competing myths, you know, and there would be some pluralism. One of the issues in Russia is that you don't have this pluralism, partly for legal reasons, because alternative views of history are criminalized in some cases. For example, when it comes to certain opinions on the Second World War, not even opinions, sometimes they're historical facts, such as the USSR occupied the Baltic states. That's not a position you would want to go around shouting outside the Kremlin. So that's one aspect of it, and the other aspect is I suppose how much buy-in there's been from the population. So often we focus on Putin, but really my research has always been interested in that interaction between state and society, and the extent to which the state, yes, it co-opts, it creates a sense of demand for some of these things, but also it appeals to cultural elements that already existed. And so I think if we just focus on Putin or on the Kremlin, on the top-down elements, we're really missing what they appealed to, why these historical myths were needed. What do they answer? And it doesn't necessarily matter whether or not they're true. I mean, it matters to a historian, it matters on lots of other levels. But I suppose from my sort of more sociological or cultural point of view, what I find fascinating is that people need these myths and they find them consoling. And I think that there's a need there that will need to be met. And I don't see in my research and in continuing studies that there's any sort of appetite for a very westernized style of economics, or a very westernized style of organizing society and approach to sort of, I suppose, the cultural elements of society. And in a way, Putin has managed to wrap this up as if all of these myths constitute a sort of a Russian exceptionalism, as if Russia is somehow innately, almost uniquely in touch with its past, with its traditions. It's aware of the real history, and it will help others to stay aware or to get back to their own authentic roots. The extent to which people really truly believe this, that's not a question for a researcher, because it's impossible to really define, but there's certainly a lot of evidence that people buy into it and act it out, and at that point, well, then it becomes sort of more of a philosophical question of what is belief anyway.
I want to ask you about how this translates directly into the Ukraine war, but I'm going to put that aside for just a second, and we're going to come to that in a couple of minutes. But you mentioned sort of the use of this mythology. But one of the things that they have de-emphasized is a lot of the worst elements of the old Soviet Union and the sins of some of the leaders. How do they reconcile? How does Putin reconcile that history with the mythology that he's trying to create?
So the history, if we talk, for example, about the history of the gulags or of the 1930s and the Great Terror, or so if we talk about the sort of tragedies inflicted on Russians, then they aren't entirely ignored, they're more justified. So yes, the basic narrative, if we look through the history textbooks, if we look at sort of what's shown on, I suppose, like popular history documentaries on TV, it's, yes, it was a shame, like that was a tragedy, it went too far, but ultimately it was needed for industrialization and therefore to win the war. And now let's talk about the war again. So it is acknowledged, it's just not really, they tried to mitigate, they tried to justify it. And I would point out that this is as opposed to the sort of crimes that Russia has committed against other peoples and nations, and those tend to be either completely ignored or they are denied, very aggressively. And sometimes you even feel like you've seen some progress, maybe, and it goes back. So the obvious example here is the execution by the NKVD of thousands and thousands of Polish officers in the forest of Katyn during, just before, it was during the Second World War, just before the Great Patriotic War. And this was acknowledged. There was even some attempts at reconciliation. And then recently, there's been a trend at the most official and highest levels to start denying it again. So I'm not sure that they're that bothered about whether or not they come off as credible historians. I think they're very aware that this myth, and one of the most interesting, I suppose, sort of like historical entrepreneurs here is the former Minister of Culture, Vladimir Medinsky, who also is now a presidential aide on questions of memory and is widely rumored to have written Putin's infamous On the Historical Unity of Ukrainians and Russians essay. And he says that he said something that always stays in my mind, which is that, sometimes myth is more true than fact, and no credible historian, would completely dismiss myth. And the idea is that there is a truth within certain myths that means that it has to be defended. And even if the fact gets in the way of that, then the fact is to go, not the myth.
So how does this myth-making translate on the street? Another way of asking that is, he has a domestic audience. What are they saying or thinking? And I realize that there are limitations to what we can actually learn, but how is it being perceived in Russia?
So I did a lot of field work with different kind of, I suppose, grassroots people who got involved and created their own clubs that were sort of military patriotic or military history clubs to teach often young people, sometimes just sort of interested parties, about Russian patriotic history. And very often they didn't see their views as completely aligning with the government's. They understood that the government was using it, sort of instrumentalizing memory for political purposes, but they found common cause with them. And bluntly, the government provided funding and money for certain activities. And so it worked quite well. So for example, if we're talking about clubs and camps, it's quite often children, I guess a bit like in the US, will go to summer camps And if we look at some of the camps that are available in Russia, so there's a very famous one called Strana Geroyev, which is like Country of Heroes. And their pupils can go and they can learn how to engage in historical disinformation battles. They can learn how to reenact. They can learn about specific battles. And this is a sort of a network of clubs that's across the country. There's also sort of clubs that are after school clubs. There's been a massive sort of effort to compete with Hollywood in terms of Russian films. So there's one society in particular, the Russian Military Historical Society, and that has really engaged with popular culture. So it's contributed, so between 2013 and 2020, it contributed to over 600 films and TV series on history, and that normally meant shaping the script. And that society is headed by Vladimir Medinsky, who we just discussed, the man who likes myths but not facts. And they work there's another very similar society that also engages with this, I suppose, public-facing history, and that's called the Russian History Society, and that's headed by Sergei Narishkin, who is the head of Russia's version of the CIA. So it's the people who are involved are pretty heavyweight, I think it's fair to say, but it really does filter down even into sort of child education, into sort of after-school clubs, and of course into the infrastructure, whether or not that's putting up plaques, putting up statues, or painting murals, which is also quite a popular thing now, to paint sort of murals of local war heroes from World War II on apartment buildings.
So I guess the term mind control would not really apply here, but myth control might be a proper description of what's happening.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's playing on people's emotions. It's playing on something that's there, that's organic, this pride in the Great Patriotic War, and then it's making people feel as if that's under threat, that people are trying to destroy that, people are trying to take it away or to rubbish it, and therefore Russia has to defend its history. And so it plays on people's fears, plays on what they feel proud of, and it plays on that sense of insecurity that they have.
Jade, I feel like we're just scratching the surface on memory makers, but I want to turn to your other book, Russia's War, and ask, what's the link here? How does this myth making and this selective application of history frame the war in Ukraine for the Russian people?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I looked at in Memory Makers was what I call historical framing, which is sort of a few episodes where sort of Russian media, and I looked at around sort of 6 to 8 different pro-Kremlin sources. Sometimes they're just Kremlin sources, sometimes they're just sort of Kremlin aligned. And I looked at how they use these really intensive kind of historical analogies. And one of the most obvious cases was 2014, which they presented as Russia taking back Crimea and defending the Donbass, sort of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine against resurgent Nazis. And this was a narrative that was really incredibly detailed, incredibly emotional, and it played on sort of narratives from the Soviet Union that Ukrainians during World War II were Nazi collaborators, and that's essentially who had come to power. And so I found it very odd then when in 2022 people said, oh, where's this Nazi narrative come from? And why would Russians believe that? And you think, well, it's been there for 8 years. It's there in films. If you watch sort of all of the World War II films, if there's ever a Ukrainian, they're often sort of a traitor trying to work with the Nazis, or they are a good Ukrainian who essentially just speaks Russian, maybe with a slightly funny accent, and recognizes that they're not really Ukrainian, they're just kind of a little Russian, to use the term, the sort of imperial era term. And so I think that's really what pushed it is, well, 2 things. First is that with Memory Makers, all the time when I was writing it and all the time when I was doing the research, because of course it formed part of my PhD, I felt like I was avoiding where my research was pointing me, in that sense of, okay, so, my thesis is that this isn't just propaganda, that people believe this, that there's buy-in, and my interviews and my fieldwork are showing that, okay, people are actually sort of at least accepting this and it's kind of shaping their worldview. So then where does that lead? where does that lead? If we look at these essays, that Putin is writing, surely they would have to act on this. And I thought, well, okay, probably they will, but it won't be now, because the West isn't weak enough, and in their view, and because of course Ukraine would never give in. They'd need to do some things. But it turns out clearly their intelligence on Ukraine was very faulty. And they did act on it. And I think, after the chaos and the horror of the 24th of February 2022, then I started to see people sort of referring to it as, okay, this is Putin's war, and just as soon as Russians know, and it wasn't, then they'll turn against it. And I knew that that wasn't true. And I almost felt like Russia's war was like the epilogue to memory makers, because I understood why that wouldn't be the case. And it isn't because there's something essentially wrong with Russians, it's because of the context that came before, and the different ways in which people had been sort of co-opted, but also, limited by certain opportunities, but also given in sometimes the things that were appealing, and all of that within a very repressive atmosphere. So I felt like it was important to explain it for that reason, because it felt like we were just kind of otherwise sort of shunting between two binaries of, oh, all Russians support the war because they're innately always been evil and imperialistic, or no Russians support the war, this is all just Putin, and once he's gone it will all go away. And both views are going to make for pretty bad policy.
Well, Jade, the two books themselves are an outstanding contribution to our understanding. The one is Memory Makers, the other is Russia's War, and we can't recommend them enough. Thank you so much for being with us. She's Jade McGlynn. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on social media or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.